Hey Future Twig, Past Twig here, and this is the presentation for our Death Draw deck. I never was able to come up with a better name for it than that, but you know what, it kind of just says what it does on the tin, and all the other names I could come up with for this deck based on what it does were just inappropriate and just not helpful for what we were trying to do, so we're just going to stick with Death Draw. And let's get right into this deck tech. As you know, inspiration for this deck came from two main types of spells, and that would be the kind of pump spells like Giant Growth, growing our creatures larger, and then the Feign Death kind of cards where you basically can give a creature the ability to come back upon its death or being sacrificed. And I just look at these both cards. They're very underutilized and underplayed, I think, in Commander. I think people tend to look down on these types of instances because they don't usually have a massive impact about creatures, and primarily they're also like one shot, one trick, basically. They're one-trick ponies. After they get used, they're just gone, and their resources are gone, and they don't replenish themselves. They're not cantrips in that way. So I was like, I wonder if there's a way where we could basically utilize these and turn them into a very powerful recurring engine in a Commander setting. Guidelines for us are fairly simple. Each and every single card in our deck has to be at or under $1, and that also means $50 or less for the whole entire deck, and obviously only Commander legal cards, because I'm not wanting an infinity weird cards or silver bordered cards in there, because that screws up the whole thing. Alrighty, getting into it. The commander I eventually settled on is I love playing underwhelming commanders, and Shadowheart Dark Justicar is perfect for this. Sacrificing other creatures and drawing cards based on the creature's power. Literally exactly what this deck is going to be fantastic for. Almost all of our spells, be they the reanimation spells or the buff spells themselves, will inevitably increase our creature's power and give us the ability to draw massive amounts of cards for a very small mana cost and the sacrifice of the creature. Aside Shadowheart, we also went with Master Chef. Green has a lot of our pump spells, so that combos well with the black, which has all of the reanimation spells. And perhaps most importantly, it also with Master Chef, we also can get more +1/+1 counter creatures. Get more +1/+1 counters on our creatures. My gosh, I cannot talk today. And make them even stronger. And on top of that, it also means that our turn 3 and turn 4 plays at the beginning of the game are decided on. So as long as we ramp a tiny bit in the beginning of the game, we basically have our first couple of turns already dealt with, which is just wonderful. However, for any reason, if you don't like, older commanders or commanders that are like partner-based or background-based, you can always go with one of the newer commanders from the Final Fantasy set, Genova, Ancient Calamity, because she does a very similar things, putting counters on creatures based on her power, and that whenever those creatures die, they will draw cards equal to their power. One thing with this is that you're going to have to include more sacrifice outlets because this commander does not inherently kill off creatures, and so you're going to need some way to kill those creatures off to actually get the benefit. Which leads us into the deck plan. Deck plan for this deck is actually very simple. You just want creatures that benefit from having large of power. For example, Nance the Shambler here, where its power will relate to the number of green scroll tokens it creates when it dies. Then you want to be able to buff them up with stuff and clean cards to just scale up, which is a wonderful card for 1 mana, being able to make a 6/4 out of 1/1. Fantastic, and that overload ability is even like a win con kind of tacked on there. And then, of course, you want cards that benefit from that. So, for example, we have fight cards like Hunter's Talent, which also in turn can be leveled up to give us even more attack. Trample, which is fantastic for getting over opponent's defenses and for drawing cards, as long as our cards are, obviously going to be powerful enough, which with buff spells, no issue. And yeah, you just want to kind of profit off of effects like that. And also we have Marin and Body Launderer doing the same kind of thing where they can reanimate based on how strong their power is and how many creatures have died. For win cons, it's fairly simple. We have Puppeteer Click here, which works wonderfully with Master Chef. That persist trigger basically brings it back all the time with a -1/-1 counter, but Master Chef gives a +1/+1 counter. They cancel each other out, so it can constantly be recurred for cards. And additionally, it also brings out our opponent's bombs out of their graveyard. But however, if that doesn't work or we don't have any bombs to pick from, we can always use the classic strategy of using a bunch of buff cards to make something strong, use Trample, and just go over and kill our weaker opponents after the game has progressed a couple turns. As a side note, one of the things that I think people forget about spells like buff cards or these recursion cards is that they don't say your creature, they say target creature. So there's actually a lot of political value if you play politics at your table with these kinds of cards, because you can save somebody else's commander, you can influence somebody else's combat maneuvers even if you're not involved in the combat at all. There's a lot of things that you can do with these kinds of cards to really influence the sway of power at the table, even if you don't have creatures or get board presence on the table at the time. And it's a great way that we have cards like Invigorate, where you can actually give somebody a tiny bit of life, maybe even save them to get that benefit. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of finagle this to get a lot of advantage from your opponents, even without all the presence. So it's just a wonderful way to kind of have fun. Cards that I am personally excited to play in this deck, Genova and Calamity I've already kind of talked about in passing. She's a fantastic secondary source of card draw and buffing in this deck, and I think with a couple of buff cards on her, you can make some ridiculously strong creatures very quickly. Cards that also benefit from being ridiculously strong and having a lot of power are Rampage Rejuvenators, which basically say when this creature dies, whatever its power is, you get to find X basic land cards of that power, put them directly onto the battlefield, untapped by the way, and then shuffle. This is a fantastic way to get like a ton of basic lands out and just have a huge mana ramp turn from a creature dying. And you're probably drawing cards if you're using Shadowheart on it too. So you're double winning. You're playing lands and you're drawing cards. You're basically role playing as blue-green Simic at that time. It's crazy. Another set of cards I'm excited to play in this deck are Tanuki Transplanter. I absolutely love this card. I've always wanted to play it since I first saw it release in the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty set. And it is fantastic because basically the amount of power it gives whenever you attack, it gives you that amount of mana. And that's perfect for when you have a buff spells deck, because then you have free mana floating around that you have to use up, otherwise it's going to disappear. And buff spells are a fantastic source to sink that mana into. Additionally, we have Puppeteer click here again because, of course, being able to recur our opponent's creatures constantly while also gaining cards by killing it are just wonderful, and this is just a fantastic little synergy with our commander and secondary commander with the background. Finally, Hollow Merc Siege is a brand new card. I'm very excited to use this enchantment in this deck. We can set it up as either a card draw engine, consistent card draw engine, because we're going to have a lot of +1 counters from our background, or if we're worried about more attack power, we can always go Abzan, and then we just can basically put +1/+1 counters on a target creatures, and additionally give them menace so that we force people into a 2-for-2 situation. Because one of the things with buff cards is that when you're using that, it's kind of like a 2-for-1 potentially if you're killing something. But with menace, we could potentially get 2 creatures for 1 buff card, and that's just one wonderful little setup. Also, we have Wild Defiance. I've never seen this card before I started looking up stuff for this deck. And it's an amazing card. It's perfect for this deck. Basically, it turns any single instant or sorcery that targets a creature, which is like half of our bloody deck, and it makes it so that basically it gets +3/+3 or a giant growth on top of what any other effects you're giving them. And this also works if opponents are targeting our creatures as well. So if our opponent targets a creature for destruction with a piece of removal, we can respond to tap Shadowheart to destroy the creature, and we'll get an extra 3 cards off of that, which is just fantastic value even if we lose a creature that we want to keep. So there's all sorts of little amazing benefits here. Deck stats wise, we've actually done very well here. I was able to kind of keep a lot of the decks small, so it's a lot of low cost cards, which is good because our commander has an activated ability, and we want to have a lot of free mana open so that we can actually keep up mana for our buff spells even on our turn or other people's turns. Currently, in the current iteration of the deck, we have 24 creatures, 5 sorceries, 21 instants, 4 artifacts, 8 enchantments, and 36 lands officially, but we do have a two-sided card that also can double as a land, so it's kind of more 37. Grand total of the deck came to $29.69, and that includes the fact that I still have a couple of cards hanging out on the sideboard, so it's probably closer to like $28. Either way, very inexpensive. I think it could be a very explosive deck. I can't wait to try it out. As you know, Future Twigs is currently just kind of an experimental deck that I haven't had a chance to field test a lot. So I'm hoping that we can win some games with it, or at least influence some board states with it. That would be fun. Kind of last little thing I have here is improvements. Obviously, every deck, if you want to sink more money into it, has some amazing improvements. And 2 of those that immediately come to mind are Marwyn the Nurturer and Kami of Whispered Hopes. Kami of Whispered Hopes in particular is insane because of our Master Chef automatically giving +1/+1 counters to creatures that enter the battlefield. Giving them extra counters is just going to make them even more strong. And the ability to buff its power and just get mana of any color is just phenomenal. But both of these cards are currently in the $2 to $3 range, so they're outside our price range. But if they ever drop, this would be wonderful slots to slide on in. And thank you very much for watching. That kind of concludes this presentation. If you've got any questions, comments, or even better yet, fun or better card recommendations, I swear Wizards of the Coast releases new cards every single day, and I can't keep track of them all. So if you know of better cards for this deck, given what it's trying to do, feel free to leave them in the YouTube comment section below, or go into the Moxfield deck list I'll have linked below, and leave your comments there. And otherwise, thank you for watching, and have a great day.